Hello and welcome to another conversation series organized by the Center of Applied Theology. My name is Gregory Shokhikyan. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham and your host today. Our topic for today is the quest for the historical Christianity, Greek and Latin perspectives. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our today's distinguished speakers. So today we have Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, an emeritus professor of historical theology at the University of Nottingham, and Professor George Demacopoulos, a professor of theology and the chair, Father John Mandorf and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at the Fordham University, US. So before jumping into our conversation, I would just like to say what the format is going to be. So the conversation is going to be between two professors, Professor Thomas O'Loughlin and George Demacopoulos, around roughly about 5 questions that I'm going to facilitate then. So and again, it will be pros and cons. So we'll start from Tom, and then we may go to George, and the next one will be from George to Tom. So it will be kind of flexible in this time, and then we will continue the discussion that will roughly take about an hour or something. So again, thank you very much to both of you. It's a pleasure to have both of you in this conversation. So without further ado, let me start. The topic that I've chosen is the quest for historical Christianity. It actually comes from my perspective. It came to my mind actually from reading the book of Rowan Williams, Why Study the Past? The quest for historical church. And we normally actually think about Christianity in terms of set of beliefs, primarily as a metaphysical system. And people regard in a kind of modern sense that Christianity is primarily a set of beliefs. And history in that regard is something accidental or artificial. Again, my mind goes to Lessing's kind of famous idea of ditch between necessary truth of reason and accidental facts or truth of the history. So my first question will be to Thomas O'Loughlin, and the same question will have a comment from Professor George Demacopoulos. What is Christianity in terms of history? And likewise, what is history in terms of Christianity?
I'd like to begin by trying to answer that by telling the story that's recorded by Eusebius of what Irenaeus said in a debate at the end of the 2nd century about whether you should celebrate Easter on the 14th day of the month Nisan, and so it's at the same time as the Passover every year, or whether it should always take place on what is the day of resurrection in the weekly cycle of Christians, which is Sunday. And Irenaeus says something like this: it doesn't matter which you do, but we have to do what we've always done. And I think that's a fascinating way of expressing what Christianity is, that it's something that we inherit, and we inherit it not just as a set of intellectual beliefs, but we inherit it as a practice. And as a practice, we feel that we now belong to something that stretches way back behind us. And indeed, we have a sense that it not just stretches a little bit back, it stretches all the way back to the apostles, and then the apostles to Jesus. So we have this sense that it's a community, and it's a community over time. And I think if anyone has that sense, and I know not all Christians living today have that sense, then it's that sense of belonging and being a way of doing things, and it's the way our group do things, is not only something peripheral to being a Christian, but almost crucial. You join us and the way we do things and the way we keep the memory of Jesus.
Thank you, Professor. That's a wonderful insight. Professor Demacopoulos, would you have any comments or response to the same question, or developing a theme that Tom has started?
Yeah, so I love that quote from Irenaeus. I didn't know it, or didn't remember it anyway, and it's really quite interesting. I mean, I think one of the things you know, since the Reformation, I think we all have in our head that to be a Christian is to subscribe to a set of kind of dogmatic claims that are set up to differentiate ourselves from others. Now, that's not to say that that didn't exist in Christian history prior to the Reformation. Of course it did, but it wasn't as central, right? I'd like to make the claim as a pre-modern historian that when we talk about the history of Christianity, to the average Christian, whether that person be a member of the clergy or a farmer or a merchant or something like that, to be a Christian was to belong to a community, and part of that community was to go through a series of ritual practices, right? It was, right, belonging to the Christian community meant you attended service and you prayed together. You celebrated the Eucharist together, right? To participate in community was about ritual and communal beseeching of the divine. It was not so much about dogmatic claims and so forth. So for that reason, to my mind, if we want to understand our connection to the Christian past, or to what Christians believed in the past, you do much better by studying things like hymnology and ritual than you do by reading polemical treatises by church fathers, right? Reading hymnography puts you into the thought world of 90% of Christians, right? Reading a polemic by Gregory Nazianzen, as much as I love St. Gregory Nazianzen, nobody read it, nobody heard it, nobody could understand it, right? So if you really want to be in connection, as Irenaeus would say, with what we did in the past, your access to that is through kind of the study of historical liturgy.
Thank you. That's a great insight. Just to develop the thing that you started it. We all know that the Christianity is a historical religion, and some would argue that even the term history kind of comes up due to Christianity. And you both are historians by training, and I was just wondering what draws you as a historian to Christianity? Professor Demacopoulos, if you could start.
Oh, so I'm first. That's a great question. What as a historian draws me to Christianity? Well, at least in terms of the Western world, right? So I'm not speaking necessarily about East Asia, but in terms of the Western world, there has probably been no larger cultural civilizational influence on the modern world than Christianity in all of its permutations. This is one of those places where historians would say Christianities, right? Because there's multiple forms of it. And I think if you, I mean, one of the primary reasons we study history is so that we can understand and navigate the present. Well, if you want to understand and navigate the present, and you're going to go into the pre-modern period, then there's arguably nothing more important to study than the influence and variety of Christianity.
Thank you. That's great. Professor Oakland, would you comment on that?
Yeah. Funnily, as a historian, I rarely quote philosophers, but I'm going to quote Søren Kierkegaard made the point that life is lived always looking forward, but it's understood looking backwards. So we're always looking back into the past to try and understand what it is that makes us the sort of human beings we are. And we don't just look, it's very obvious for the 20th century that if you want to understand where we are today, why are there problems in Israel, Palestine? Why are there problems in the Middle East? Why are there problems somewhere else? You've got to know the background story, because it's only the background story that explains the present. But if I leave aside the fact that I am actually a Christian, why do I work on history of a very long time ago? And I think it's something to do with the fact that you see the way human beings evolve over time, and you see all the varieties of what Christians have done. And that to my mind is not only a fascinating mirror to the diversity of things today, but it also somehow destabilizes the sense that many people have that we're the outcome of a necessary evolution, as if the only thing that can happen is what is happening today. And I find lots of Christians, when they're faced with problems, how do you live in a multicultural society? And some Christians retreat into a hidden place, because the recent experience of Christians is not living in multicultural societies. And yet you say, but the world in which Paul preached is a multicultural world. Christians are a tiny fraction of the cities that Paul visited and wrote to. They're even a subsection of the one group that have some level of understanding of Paul, which are the communities of Jews. So just as Jews were a small misunderstood minority in the Mediterranean, the first followers of Jesus were a misunderstood group within those Jewish communities. And so I find that the past not only allows you to situate the present, but it allows you to say, hey, things have been very different in the past. They could be very different again today.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful insight. Just to continue our conversation, Professor, you quoted Irenaeus on one of the kind of great theologians of both East and West, and I like just to tease out one sentence that he says, and just to develop on that. The things that we have done always. So which I think is actually bring us to the idea of tradition, be it with capital T or small t, and this relationship with the historical studies. So we know that, I guess, from Yves Congar, something, that we have that sort of distinguish between tradition with a capital T and the tradition with a small t. The traditional capital T, something as a kind of normative thing for a Christian understanding of Christianity, of the church, and the small t that is subject to change, but also is beneficial, but it's subject to change based on a historical development. But one of the things with Congar's understanding, and some of the theologians has pointed out, it's very difficult to have a criteria distinguishing between two, like how you distinguish between the two. So another thing that comes to my mind to that is historical path, which is kind of more, I guess it's more German Wissenschaft driven. Von Harnack comes to my mind, the German historical schools come to my mind. And I was just wondering, can we talk about the tradition and historical path? I mean, do they competitors? Do they complementary things? How they go together? Professor Olin, if you can start from you.
Well, I'd like to go back to something that George said earlier, when he said, don't bother reading Gregory Nazianzen, even if you're a great fan of Gregory Nazianzen, read the hymnology. Hey, that's right, that's where we start, right? Because you see, it's fantastic to talk about the capital T and the small t, and it sounds great. And if you're teaching undergraduates, it goes down a treat, because they all think, oh, well, that solves that problem. And particularly if you're teaching young people who are going to be clergy, they just think, right, that's the answer. I've now got the key, and off you can see them running for the door, happy they've now got the answer to everything. Of course, the problem is that you can't neatly find when does a bit of small t get treated as a bit of big T, and when something that's treated as big T become something that we really should treat as a small t. And there's a very good example of that in the Latin Catholic Church at the moment, whereas the whole question of the ordination of women as deacons. Is that a case, is that a case of big T or little t? And all the argument is, well, we did it once, but then the others say, but that's only a little t. That's not part of the big T. And the others say, well, the big T is very, and then you start going into an even greater game, saying, have we got another rule that will tell the difference between the two? But actually, tradition is completely messy, because think of that bunch of hymns that that George has referred us to. Right? In one parish, there was a great singer, and they sang 25 hymns over the course of the year. And because there were 3 or 4 good singers there, and the priest liked singing himself, they sang and sang and sang and sang. So there was a great tradition of singing. In the next parish, there was only a few squawky old people singing, and the priest had an upset tummy. He had an ulcer. And you immediately think, well, Gregory the Great, he had an ulcer. He liked short liturgies because he had an ulcer. But you see, and he said, no, I want no long hymns. I knew a priest once who never allowed more than the first and the last verse of a hymn, even if they were quite meaningless without the intervening couple, because he hated long hymns. So you realize that the tradition is just continually messy. And it's messy at the big level, because you can, like, just look at the Greeks and the Latins, and how excited they can become over the word filioque. And no one really knows whether that's a big problem or a little problem. And sometimes they get worried about this hymn or that hymn. And the interesting thing about the tradition is by its nature messy, because it's not handed on like a pure computer system where you plug in your little gadget, and then you suddenly have a complete copy, a perfect copy of what's on your little stick. Tradition is happening in 10,000 parishes in 10,000 different ways, and because it's messy, we have to continually just say, well, there are some things that are really very central, and everyone seems to be talking about them. There's some things on this, and it's because at the end of the day, the relationship is larger than either the big T or the little t.
Thank you. That's a wonderful insight about the kind of multiformity, I would say, of tradition, not just this singular item. And coming to Professor Demacopoulos, with this idea of tradition, Professor O'Loughlin said, if I can paraphrase in this way, tradition is not a collection of items that you pass on unchangeably, but it's also something, a developing thing. And this is something I remember your colleague at Fordham, Aristotle Papanikolaou, has pointed out, using Alistair McIntyre's notion of tradition as a set of practices and reasoning, saying tradition is not so much a collection of items that you just pass on from generation to generation, but it's actually kind of a process of learning how to dance, to use the Professor Papanikolaou,
his metaphor,
imagery, saying it's more like becoming a better singer or better dancer. It's a kind of an artistic, ascetic practices that you become. I'm just wondering, what were your thoughts about on that issue, as well as about the kind of, if I can push to another direction, that is Alexander Schmemann's position. He had that kind of more, I would say, ignored book, The Historical Road of Orthodoxy, which is interesting that he puts it kind of as an historical path framework, then in a kind of traditional way, like tradition as a sort of collection of items. I was just wondering, what were your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, you pointed to my colleague's work who wrote a short essay for Public Orthodoxy, and he tried to make he was really pushing back against this language that some people are traditionalists and some people aren't, right? That you can get this kind of, especially online critique of I'm the traditionalist and you're some modernist sellout, right? That sort of thing. And Aristotle's point, which was really insightful, is that there is no non-traditionalist, right? Everyone is in one way or not responding to what has come before them, and they're wrestling with it. And now they might repudiate it, but in that very enunciation of repudiation, you're still wrestling with something that has come before you. I'd like to, if I can really quickly, I want to go back to this big T, little t thing. And I think what Thomas said was really insightful. And I think holding to that dichotomy of big T, little t can really be problematic. I think it's probably a useful rule of thumb, like when you're in a parish and you're trying to explain to people, yeah, this matters and that doesn't. But as historians trying to sort of uncover, what earlier Christians of an earlier period saw as essential versus non-essential, or where variety was acceptable versus not variety. That big T, little t thing really gets complicated because as Tom said, apart from the dogmatic claims of Trinitarian theology and Christology, you're going to be hard pressed to find a whole lot of consistency across the board in pre-modern Christianity in terms of the lived practice and the lived belief of your average Christian or even your cleric. And so where the big T, little t thing might work in the present to understand what sort of traditions are essential and what are not. It's not a good rubric at all, I would argue, for trying to understand what Christians in the pre-modern period understood to be essential. I'm going to give you just one little example, and again, I'm going to go to hymnography to do it, or liturgy to do it. We cannot underestimate the significance of the printing press for cementing what liturgy looks like, right? I mean, liturgy, so my specialty is Byzantium or early Christianity. Liturgy from one region to another in the pre-modern period, in the pre-printing press period, was radically different in terms of what hymns they were singing, what structure they were adhering to. And I'm not saying there's not influence and there's some continuity, but I'm saying that regional churches had real autonomy to develop liturgy in ways that was distinctive. And it wasn't until the printing press that was then employed by people who know actual authority, at least in the Orthodox churches, right? They started running out these volumes and all of it, and they made selections about which hymns we're going to keep and which ones we're going to ignore and get rid of. It was that process that really began to cement, right, what we think, right? And so I point to that as just one example of needing to understand historical development, historical context for understanding where this sort of centrality of practice comes from and where it doesn't.
And can I cut in there and just reinforce that point? Because not only did the printing press create the idea that you could actually codify Christianity into a lovely series of things that you tick boxes. Do you believe this and do you believe that? But it even permeates the way we think about the earlier period. For instance, I said to someone a few months ago, well, have a look and see what the Galatian Sacramentary says about that. And they said, oh, well, I don't have access because of the lockdown to the new critical edition by, I can't even remember who did it. I would have to use the old Wilson edition. And I immediately chipped in and said, yeah, well, actually, that's the one I have because I bought it secondhand many years ago when I was a young man like you, Gregory. But the thing is, but he said, but that's out of date. You can't use that. That's not the Galatian Sacramentary. And I said, give me a break. Do you really think that we actually have only got a couple of manuscripts, and we're really relying on one manuscript, actually, the St. Gallen manuscript. And the theory was that there was a perfect edition back there in the first millennium. We were actually projecting our own highly standardized print universe, what Marshall McLuhan calls the Gutenberg galaxy, back into the early history of Christianity. It's almost like saying, did the early Christians have which text did they have of the Gospel of John? Was it the same as what you find in Nestle Aland 28? Well, it was somewhat like what you find in Nestle Aland 28. But just look at the hundreds of variants down in the bottom of it, and you don't know which one had which. And remember, we've only got a fraction of the manuscripts, and with liturgical manuscripts, because they wear out, because people use them and carry them around, and kids pour wax on them, and someone else puts water on them, and priests have sweaty fingers when they turn the pages. They rot. So they don't even survive like biblical manuscripts. So we don't know. All we can say is that there were certain family similarities, but when we know that when clergy went into new churches, and this is usually monks, when a monk goes from one monastery, the first thing he does is he finds out how they do it there.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's excellent. That's great.
Sorry, can I give just one more example? Because I think it's really going to drive this point home, and it has to do with some of my current research. So I'm into hymns these days, right, for the first time. And I'm going to give one example. So I think we can all agree, even though, I love Constantinople and Tom loves Rome, right? I think we can all agree that Jerusalem really matters, right? And if you know your history of liturgy, you'll know that it was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that really frames and influences the development of liturgy in Byzantium and in Rome and so forth, right? It all comes from Jerusalem. And if you really know this stuff, you'll know that the oldest surviving texts that we have are Georgian translations of Greek that no longer exists. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the oldest liturgical cycle was the Sunday Vesper Matins liturgy, right? So the oldest hymns in the world that survive at all, they survive in Georgian, but they're translations of Greek that were being performed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, okay? We have an entire 8-tonal sequence of this, thousands and thousands and thousands of hymns, okay? Now, they only survive in a couple Georgian manuscripts. The Greek, there's no Greek. So what the Christians of Jerusalem were singing for centuries, okay? Do you know can you guess what % of those hymns survive in Greek in any manuscript anywhere in the world? About 10%, right? So from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, the hymns that were being sung every Sunday in Jerusalem no longer exist, are no longer sung at all. I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? Again, just to kind of drive the point home that there is so much variation, and they simply got replaced by other hymns.
And of course, the other side of that is so much for the claim that what we're doing is the same as what they were doing. Exactly. And everything they were doing, we're doing.
Exactly.
And that's wonderful. That's a wonderful insight. Just bringing to our minds that actually the idea of original and the corruption, to use it, it's a kind of post-Reformation, post-printing, post-Gutenberg idea. Yeah. Which actually, but it's actually still dominant in some circles, especially in philology.
Sure.
That's an interesting notion. But again, coming to Professor Demacopoulos' notion about like surviving text in a different language, that the different culture preserved what we might call the original part of the tradition. The same thing where I can say, if I can intervene as my kind of Armenian side, the same thing can say from the works of Irenaeus that Professor O'Loughlin called, demonstration of apostolic preaching, preserved only in the Armenian and was published in beginning of 20th century, and now is available. The same thing that.
And another nod to the Armenians, the oldest surviving lectionary survives in Armenian.
Yes, sure.
From Jerusalem.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Yeah. Coming to another question that I just wanted to address in our conversation would be the idea of historical study, and the theological statements that we make. Like, we normally make a bunch of theological questions, especially theologians. I'm using theologians not in a pejorative sense, but in a professional sense.
I do it all the time. Don't worry.
But anyway, we use sometimes also with the popular theologians. Like let's call it that way. The popular theologians, those who are popularizing theological understandings, ideas, they mostly use ideas instead of cut off from the historical context, if I can put it like that. I was just wondering, what would you say, how history contextualize theological statement? And if you could give an example from your own tradition, be the Greek and from the Latin. So yeah, Professor Demacopoulos.
Yeah, so for this, well, I'm going to repeat something Tom heard me talk about at a conference in Greece a couple summers ago. I think one great example of this is if we look at Orthodox Catholic division, right? When I was a seminarian or a young student, I was constantly told, the schism of 1054, it was, they really broke apart. They stopped celebrating, they stopped intercommuning one another, and it all fell apart then, even though everybody knows that the actual details of the year 1054 are really stupid and so forth, that filioque was irreconcilable, papal authority was irreconcilable. And so 1054, that was it, right? And I started doing this project on the Fourth Crusade. And what I discovered, in fact, was, so if your viewers don't know these details, the Fourth Crusade is the crusade that never goes to the Holy Land; it goes to Byzantium instead. And the Latin Crusaders, sort of, my argument is that I use the language of colonization. They colonize Byzantium, and that the kind of friction of that encounter, the political, economic exploitation or whatever, is the context that gets Greek Christians to start really using the language of heresy to speak about Roman Catholics. And actually, not so much Roman Catholics themselves, but against Greeks who are willing to collaborate with the Crusaders. Right, and vice versa, right? That it's only in the context of the Fourth Crusade that you get Latin writers in the East really doubling down on the language of heresy when speaking about Greeks and forbidding communion. Right, the oldest actual, we have not a single shred of evidence that any Greek cleric ever denied communion to a Latin. Period, before the Fourth Crusade, right? That's 150, 160 years, right? After 1054. We only have evidence of it during the Fourth Crusade. And the argument of this book that I published a few years ago is that there is no new theological argument that develops, right? There's no new one synod of bishops has now adopted some new policy that didn't exist before, and so that needs to be condemned. Absolutely nothing has changed theologically or in terms of theological argument. The only thing that's changed, and it's changed dramatically, is the political, historical, economic setting, right? And it's that historical context that is driving Christians to think of their neighbors in new ways, right? New critical ways. And they're simply employing a kind of, they're appropriating a language of inside, outside, heresy, orthodoxy, to sort of set new boundaries between communities. So I would point to that as an example of where context in the history of Christianity really influences what gets said theologically in ways that we just pass right over if we don't do the hard work of understanding it.
Thank you. That's a very good point, just to bear in mind. Professor, if you could comment or respond to the same question with the Latin.
First of all, once the Fourth Crusade is mentioned, and Dandolo and his wicked horde, the first thing anyone who comes from my background has to do is say, this is one of the great historical stains on Western Christianity. This is just in the name of religion going out and wrecking your neighbor's house, This is so right. I'm almost in the position that there are so many examples of this that I don't know which one to pick, because I want to find one that I can do in a couple of minutes. But here's one. People use the phrase the Latin Church, and we know that the Western Church sees Latin as this crucial language, and then the Roman Catholic Church sees Latin as its own language, and develops this massive rhetoric on the value of Latin as it's a universal language. It allows worldwide, it's sort of like Reddit air all around the world, all around the clock. We can speak to one another in Latin, which was never actually possible. You listen to a Spaniard pronouncing Latin, it sounds very much like Spanish, and listen to a German pronouncing Latin, and it sounds like a really weird language. And then in between, you've got the Italians and the Irish who use a completely different pronunciation system. And then, so it was never this. The funny thing is, Latin probably came in because Christians didn't like the fact that most of the people they were now dealing with were barbarians, so they refused to translate the liturgy for them. So what was intended, so the liturgy is always available everywhere. I read this this encomium of Latin from a Catholic bishop in Texas of all places, how many Ciceronians does he find in his congregation on a Sunday morning? And he built this whole myth up, and it's merely because in the 4th century, the barbarians are slave takers. They're taking your land, they're stealing your slaves, they're running your city, and they're using you just as mediocre civil servants. So you're not going to speak to them, and you're certainly not going to translate your most sacred language. It becomes a way of hiding from the people who are actually there. So it creates then a two-tier Christianity of the nice people who can learn Latin or who speak Latin, and then the mob who've been suddenly reduced. So there's a whole experience in the Western Church that I don't think is shared by the Armenians and the Georgians and the Greeks, because they were actually still using the language more or less. Okay, it was becoming a more rarefied language. That's what happens with ritual and liturgy. It tends to use yesterday's jargon. But in the West, there was an in-group who knew and an out-group who were just told what it meant. And then that leads to another level of development, because people wonder, how did the Western Church get so obsessed with the idea of what are you looking at in the white wafer at the Eucharist? Well, it's a very simple way. Can you imagine a beautiful, brilliant Latin scholar, Isidore of Seville, Bishop of Seville, dies in the year 630, probably one of the most learned men of his age, and yet he's working for a real thug of a Visigothic king. Yeah. This guy is up there with he's not in the Genghis Khan League, but this guy is not a civilized person at all. He's a barbarian in every sense. And he has to go and sit for over an hour on a Sunday morning and listen to all these guys ratting on in Latin. And he says, well, why am I doing this? And Isidore comes up with an idea. Because it's a mystery. You're doing it because it's a mystery. And it's a miracle. And he gives him all these reasons. He says, okay, it's a bore, but if it's that important, I'll put up with it anyway. And so what's then seen as an absolutely wonderful Western never, of course, say that to a Greek, because they will immediately tell you that the Latin verb system is very weak. But and then Western theologians go, oh, the wonderful theology of Eucharistic presence. An awful lot of it is cooked up to deal with the sociological problems of the 4th and early 5th century, and then the reaction to when they're actually in power, whether that's in the Lombards in Italy annoying Gregory the Great, or the Visigoths in Spain annoying Isidore of Seville a generation later.
Thank you. That's a wonderful insight from the historical point. Again, a very good point, a very good example, Professor Loughlin. Just to kind of develop what we are talking thus far, I was wondering, can you give also an example of how history can play in some of the way a therapeutic function, a therapeutic role in reconciliation? You pointed out kind of more problems and issues that are coming up from the history, which are very good and very illuminating. But I was wondering, could you also point out some of the historical incidents, or maybe historical events or personalities that actually show us how to move forward in a reconciled and a renewed and a healed manner between Christians of different historical paths? Professor Loughlin, if you could start.
Yeah, I'd like to. Well, look, I'll go for a very easy one, and that's the Didache. Philotheos Briennios is a very brilliant young Greek priest in the 19th century, and he had got the chance to go to Germany. So he went to Germany and learns there from, I can't remember the name of his teacher, Tischendorf. He learns from Tischendorf how to really work with manuscripts. So he goes back to Constantinople, and luckily he's not put into a parish, he's put in to catalogue the patriarchal. Now I think he's sent to teach in the seminary. George may correct me if I'm wrong. He's sent to teach in the seminary, and part-time he catalogues the library. And there in the 1870s, he finds a text which he realizes must be a 1st or 2nd century text. And it must be indeed a version, notice what I said earlier, we're not saying it's the text, it's a version of a text that had been referred to by people like Didymus the Blind, writing in Greek, and Jerome writing in Latin, and other people writing in Syriac. And he says, I think I found it. He then spends 10 or 11 years producing an edition. The edition, again, it's because if he hadn't been a Greek, he wouldn't have been in the library and able to find it. And if he hadn't been trained in Germany, he wouldn't have been able to recognize it when he found it. And then he finds, and he produced an edition of the Didache. And within months, there's an edition in French and German and English, their translations. And suddenly looking at the past and realizing that the past is different to the way we remember the past, allowed churches east and west to say, it was not as neat as either of us thought. And then it allowed churches in the west to think, who were also fighting with one another, hey, it wasn't as neat as we thought or as you thought. And it's taken over 150 50 years for that text to work its magic. But I still see it working with a text that shocks our memories can often be a tremendous opening to being able to start conversations again.
Thank you, Professor Demacopoulos.
Yeah, so I like that example a lot. I'm going to give, if you'll allow me, I'm going to give two, but I'll make them quick. Two really, really different kinds of examples, because your question is a really important one. So the first one I'm going to give is an early modern example. And it's the example, it has to do with, so I'm thinking, I mean, it's where my work usually goes. I'm thinking about Orthodox Catholic division, right? And people get into these sedimented positions that they set up against the other side, and they just assume that their side's always right, right? And so on the papal authority issue, right, you can find a whole lot of Eastern Christians who are just having none of papal authority at any level. And so the example I want to offer here is that when John Chrysostom is sent into exile, right, and he's sent into exile by the emperor, I believe it's Arcadius, he writes an appeal to the Bishop of Rome, Innocent, right, and we have these letters. And we even have Innocent's response. So the very act of the Archbishop of Constantinople having been forced into exile and appealing to the Pope as a senior cleric, right, to intervene on his behalf for the emperor, right, it is a clear demonstration, right, of the way that, let's say someone as influential as John Chrysostom understood the authority of the Bishop of Rome in his own era. Okay, now jump forward 1600 years. All right, my institution, Fordham University, to my knowledge, was the first Roman Catholic institution in the modern world to open a center of Orthodox Christian studies. Right, so we have an Orthodox center in a Jesuit Roman Catholic institution. Now, that model is being replicated elsewhere, but it was Fordham that did it first, right? And one of the things Fordham actually facilitated was the return of the relics of St. Gregory the Theologian, Nazianzen, and St. John Chrysostom from the Vatican, right? The very last public act that Pope John Paul II did before he passed away was he co-presided over a Vesper service with the Ecumenical Patriarch, where they returned the relics that had been looted in the Fourth Crusade of St. Gregory and St. John. They returned them to the Ecumenical Patriarch. And Archbishop Demetrius, the Greek bishop of the United States, was present at that Vesper service. And at that Vesper service, he read the letters of John Chrysostom and Innocent, right? And so it just shows how I think there are these occasions in the past that can be bridge building, right? And on rare occasions, like in 2004, can really be recovered as the model for Christian brotherhood. So that's the example, the kind of combined example I'd like to give.
Now, that's a wonderful examples from both of you. In a way, showing that the complexity, what we are talking about previously in the historical matter, is not just the complexity in a negative sense, but also in a positive sense, that it's not that so clear cut, but in both ways. So thank you for this wonderful conversation that we're having, and we're coming to an end to our conversation. I don't want to keep you too much because you know it's a Zoom, it's not in live conversation, so we have all our physical conditions. So I was just wondering if you can wrap up our conversation with just both of you mentioning two books that you find most illuminating, that are listeners or viewers can go up and take up two books on from your tradition that you think is a kind of good introductory to a historical understanding of Greek Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism or Western Christianity in general. Professor Demacopoulos, if you can start with you.
Okay, so yeah. Okay, well, I'll do two close to heart, right? So anyone who wants a kind of insight into Byzantine Christianity, the book still to start with is John Meyendorff's book, Byzantine Theology. And what's so efficient about that book is that it flows diachronically, right? It tells a historical story. But then the second half of the book goes theoretically, and it takes up important theological themes that the Byzantines were concerned with. And I would say that that book has not been replaced since he wrote it 30 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago. And then another book, Western Christians, I think, are increasingly interested in the concept of theosis, right? This Eastern Christian understanding of, in a sense, the meaning of the Christian life. And my colleague Aristotle's first book, of course, now I can't think of the name of it. Hold on, I have it on my shelf. What's it called? It is called...
is it Theological as Political? If I
no, it's his first book. What's the name of it? I don't see it. Anyway, look up Aristotle Papanikolaou. It's his first book. It's on Zizoulis. What the book studies is it's a study of theosis through the lens of probably the two most influential 20th century theologians, who are Losky and Zizoulis, and how the two of them understand theology. They come about theosis from a completely different point of view, but Aristotle's account of what they're doing really kind of, I would make the case, democratizes theosis. So it's not just something that some holy man standing on his head in the desert can participate in, but it's something that everyone has access to.
Thank you very much, Professor Loughlin.
Well, I'm glad that George went first on that one, because I've been rattling my brains to try and find what book. And look, I don't know whether this is the best book or not, but look, this is the book that's, how I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the book that I have most enjoyed reading in the last year. And it's this one. And it's by a Greek theologian. He teaches in Thessaloniki. And his name is Nicholas Ludovicos. And why I'm fascinated by this book is, here is a modern Greek theologian using history to overturn all the dualities that make us misinterpret the incarnation in so many ways. This is an attempt to try and say, instead of thinking of divisions and then the incarnation, let's think of the incarnation and then a unified humanity. And the curious thing is, it's a Greek theologian, but he takes on both the Greeks and the Latins and uses the Latins to beat the Greeks and the Greeks to beat the Latins. And I think it's just a wonderful example of how, what good historical theology can do. So that's the book. And that was only published a couple of years ago. It's a new book. So.
Yeah, I found the name of the book. It's Being with God is Aristotle's volume on Losky and Zizoulis that I was trying to think of.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for both of you, Professor O'Loughlin, Professor Demacopoulos, for joining me in this stimulating and productive conversation of exploring the historical and, in some cases, contemporary issues. Going back to our question that I've started is, why study the past? I think the answer will be, based on our today's conversation, will be because it's about us. It's about how history shapes us and how, in a way, we shape history. And the whole hope in that is that we are still in the process. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.